I just got the high sign. I've got to start. Good morning, everyone. Good to see you again. Um, Today's topic is a little bit strange. It's hard to explain what it is. You'll find out once I've done it. Uh, but the reason I'm doing this is partly I wanted to do something that tied together a large part of the World Cruise, and this talk does. It deals with people living in Hawaii, in Tahiti, in Fiji, in Samoa, New Zealand, Indonesia. Uh, so a very large part of the trip is actually going to be brought into the talk that's coming out today. The other thing is I have a great fondness for many things, but two things in particular. One is language, and the other is geography and maps. And so we're going to be talking a lot about language and talking a lot about geography as well. So here is the topic, extraordinary travelers. And you see the names of these places, Taiwan, Hawaii, Indonesia, Tahiti, Madagascar, and New Zealand. So what do these places all have in common? Well, they are all peopled by descendants of travelers speaking related languages and practicing similar cultures. And I say New Zealand, of course, I'm talking about the Maori, and Hawaii, about the native Hawaiians. But they all have this in common, that their languages are actually related to each other, even as far away as Madagascar, the island off the east coast of Africa. And they are descended from people not only share this similar language and culture, but who traveled thousands and thousands of miles over open ocean. And the whole story I'm going to tell lasted only 5,000 years, which we'll see in a minute, it seems like a long time, but 5,000 years is only 5% of the time since human beings began to emerge out of Africa. So that was about 100,000 years ago, and only 5% of that time is what we're talking about with this movement of peoples over a vast area. Now, most experts believe that the origin of all of this is in Taiwan. Here is a map of Taiwan showing various language groups, tribes that lived in Taiwan before the Chinese came to the island. Ethnic Chinese, who now predominate on the island, did not come until the 1600s, which has got its sort of a political implication even for today, because China claims that Taiwan has always been a part of China. In fact, Chinese history goes back 3,000 years, and only a few hundred years of that has Taiwan been a part of China, because there were no Chinese living there. But there were these people living there. They're now called the Aboriginal people of Taiwan. And they spoke a variety of languages that were related to each other, but were totally different from Chinese. After the Chinese arrived in the 1600s, they drove most of these more primitive people into the mountain spine, as you can see on the map there. They drove the mountains. The west coast is a coastal plain, the most fertile part of the island, and so the Aboriginal people were driven into the mountains. And their descendants live there today. They're only 2% of Taiwan's population today. But keep in mind that they all spoke languages that were related to each other. So I'm going to leave Taiwan for a minute and now go to the Pacific. For several hundred years, travelers have noted, as European travelers, people from the outside, have noted similarities, even quite close similarities, in the languages spoken by the natives of places as far apart as Hawaii, Tahiti, and New Zealand. James Cook, Captain Cook, traveled on his first voyage, we talked about in the history of New Zealand, with a Tahitian interpreter named Tupaya, who discovered when they arrived in New Zealand that he could communicate very well with the Maori who were living there. He was a native Tahitian, thousands of miles apart, but he could talk quite easily with the Maori. Later on, when Cook made his third voyage, which ended unhappily for him, the Tahitian interpreters, could understand the Hawaiians in the same way. So these languages were quite close to each other, not identical, but really quite similar to each other. Then, in a somewhat later period, travelers discovered grammatical and vocabulary similarities in the languages of the Philippines, the Netherlands, Indies, and British Malaya. And these similarities tied these languages and cultures of those who spoke them to the far-flung peoples of the Pacific Ocean. So they noticed similarities among the languages of Southeast Asia. Here's a map showing these various branches of what are known as Malayo-Polynesian languages, and they are related to the languages spoken out in the islands as well. Finally, linguists discovered that even in Madagascar over here, which is, should be way over here, in fact, off the coast of Africa, the native people there also spoke a language with many similarities to the languages of Southeast Asia and of particularly maritime Southeast Asia, the islands and the Malay Peninsula. Their language was similar to these other languages. And so linguists began to refer to this family of languages as Malayo-Polynesian languages, because the two main centers of the languages were in Polynesia and then in the islands of the Indies, where the Malay language, which is virtually identical to the Indonesian language, were spoken. So Malayo-Polynesian, tying together the two main centers of this language family. Here are some examples of the words. I think you can probably read these. I just wanted to very quickly illustrate what some of these similarities were. You can see, for instance, the word for two is rua, lua, rua, rua, dua. Over here, this is PMP, which is Proto-Malayo-Polynesian. This is what linguists assume the original word was that developed into these other words. But they're all quite similar. The word for dead is mate in all of these languages, except it's mati in Malay and patay in Tagalog, the language of the Philippines. Here's a word actually that I think most of us know. It's the word mata. Matahari was the spy during World War I. And the name is actually the Malay term for the sun. Mata is eye, hari is day. The eye of the day is the sun. But you can see that is actually identical all the way across to these far-flung places. The word for eating is kai in most places, makan in Malaya or in the Malay language. But again, the similarities, even the five, Rima, Nima, Rima, Rima, Lima. When we were in Fiji, we went through a government housing project, and the street names were numbered, but they were spelled out. And Lima was the name of one of the streets in this housing project in Fiji. So this was just a little bit of an illustration of the similarities of the languages over these areas. Now, when these similarities were discovered, naturally people began to wonder why people living so far apart, that is over half of the Earth's circumference, this language family is spread out. How did they come to be where they are? Where did they come from, and how did they get where they are? And the science of linguistics came into play. Those native tribal people in Taiwan that we talked about, anthropologists and linguists noticed that there were some similarities among those languages with the Malayo-Polynesian languages. And in fact, the languages spoken down here in the south, and they're still spoken on this island and in this area, are classified as Malayo-Polynesian languages. They're close enough to the other Malayo-Polynesian languages to have them classified this way. And a result of comparing the Taiwan languages with Malayo-Polynesian, linguists came up with a new term they call the Austronesian language family. Austronesian means the southern islands, so it's the language family of the southern islands. But there is a relationship. Now, according to one prominent linguist, 9 of the 10 primary branches of the Austronesian language family are spoken by the native Taiwanese. So 9 branches over here. Even though there aren't that many people, and even though they live quite close together, because they have spoken these languages over such a long period of time, they have diverged each from each other. So you have 9 branches of the Austronesian language family in Taiwan, or Formosa as it was once called. Only one branch is the Malayo-Polynesian branch. Now, linguists generally accept that the chronology of the dispersal of languages within a given language family can be traced from areas of the greatest linguistic variety to that of the least linguistic variety. And so they came to the conclusion that you have much more variety up here among these 9 branches than you do in this single branch. Even though it's spread out over a huge area, this led them to conclude that the people speaking all of these languages, Malayo-Polynesian language, came originally from people living in Taiwan. And so you have this theory that that's where all of this great movement of the Malayo-Polynesian people began. Anthropologists have looked into this much more closely, and in fact, other sciences like anthropology and archaeology have confirmed this theory that Taiwan was the origin of these people moving out. And here is a map that shows what happened. In 5,000 years, the movement began. That's the estimate. At first, they came down to the Philippines, and then into the other islands, mainly islands, a little bit of the mainland over here, of Southeast Asia. So that's all between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago. They also moved down into Melanesia. Fiji, where we were, is part of Melanesia over here. Then at about 2,000, and these are years ago, 2,000 years ago, people in these large canoes, long-range canoes, then traveled and went to Madagascar, where they were probably the first human beings. Even though Madagascar is so close to Africa, which is where humanity began, apparently no human beings had, certainly it may have reached, but it never settled in Madagascar. So these people speak a language very similar to what's spoken over here in Indonesia. And then finally you have the great Polynesian dispersal. Here's a map that concentrates just on Polynesia. That people began moving out of this area. Now this is reverted to, instead of years ago, it is the BC and AD versions of things. So they began to come down. You see they went to Fiji, Samoa, then over into the Society Islands over here, Tahiti. That was around 200 BC to 0, so around the beginning of the current era. Then by 600 AD, they had made their way to Hawaii. 700 AD to Easter Island, which is the eastern most point of this dispersal. And then finally, the last group in this great Polynesian migration made it to New Zealand in between 1250 and 1300 AD. And this, as I mentioned at the beginning, was an extraordinarily fast movement of peoples over vast distances. And a term is used because in the context of human history, it was so fast. Historians have begun to call it the Austronesian explosion. That was actually the title I first used for this talk. But then I got people coming in and wanting to learn about what is this, some destructive material, or is this an earthquake or something, or a volcano? But the explosion part refers to how fast it was, the movement of these people. Now, how did they manage to spread so far from their original homeland? First of all, they were great sailors. When Europeans first encountered the Polynesians in Tahiti and other Pacific islands, they couldn't conceive of how these islanders' ancestors could have sailed such immense distances. Their boats, by the European lights, were rather primitive. You can see this in the contrast. This is Cook's ship when he was in the Hawaiian Islands. But compared with this monstrous big ship here, they had these small canoes. People couldn't figure out how in the world they could have traveled all of these great distances. Well, Cook was one of the first Europeans to really look into this. He was very fascinated by the subject. His interpreter, Tupaia, that I mentioned earlier, was also a great navigator. He helped Cook to navigate. Even though Cook had modern navigation instruments of the time, Tupaia was very helpful in using things like the sun, the moon, the stars, and the currents and so forth as a means of navigating as Cook traveled over this vast Pacific area. But Westerners still, for a long time, harbored doubts that these what they thought were primitive people could have sailed so far with the tools and materials and technologies that they had. And this, of course, reflected more the cultural values of the Europeans than it did an appreciation of the islanders themselves. In the 20th century, two theories developed about how Polynesia particularly was settled. The first one was all of this movement was nothing more than chance. If enough people set out to sea in these primitive boats with few navigational skills, as the Europeans thought, eventually some of them are going to find themselves on habitable islands. And according to this theory, many thousands of people were lost at sea because they really didn't know what they were doing. They were just taking a chance. The other theory that developed was the Kon-Tiki theory, and I'm sure many of us at our age can remember when the book Kon-Tiki came out. This was this Norwegian, Thor Heyerdahl, who had the idea that the Pacific Islands were settled by people from the Americas. In other words, totally contrary to the theory that I've just been talking about, that in fact there are some prevailing winds that go from east to west, and the Kon-Tiki raft was constructed to prove the theory that the settlement in the islands actually came from the Americas. That, however, has now been pretty much debunked by scientists. There's just too much evidence in the other direction, particularly modern things like DNA and so forth, that tell us that the movement that I described, starting in Taiwan, coming south and moving into the Pacific, is where the Pacific Islanders actually came from. And it's only really in fairly recent years that most experts have come to the conclusion that these early travelers could have actually purposely sailed these great distances. A number of people from Hawaii, Tahiti, and New Zealand and other islands have for the last 40 years conducted what is known as experimental archaeology. They built and sailed canoes modeled as closely as they could make them on the kinds of craft that might have been used during the Polynesian migration. And they used only traditional navigational techniques, and they were able to prove by sailing these vessels like this one. This is the Polynesian Voyaging Society of Hawaii, using vessels like this, that they proved that if you don't have modern navigation, if you use just these traditional methods, you can indeed travel these great distances and find a place out there in the vast ocean. So this sort of experimental archaeology has confirmed what the other scientists were saying using linguistics and anthropology and so forth. So these experiments and a better understanding of Polynesian navigation have led to the conclusion that the early exploration was probably mostly coastal sailing in relatively primitive craft from Taiwan down to the Philippines and throughout the islands of Indonesia and the Malay Peninsula. For the further travels that came, of course, much later, a theory is developed that the island chain from Indonesia over here, but along here, all of this island chain is, the islands are all visible one to the other, so that people could take off in the canoes, seeing what their goal was. And scientists have begun to call this a voyaging nursery. In other words, over the generations, and we are talking about hundreds of years, the people could experiment with these long-range canoes, knowing that they could see where they were going. And it's the island chain that's called the nursery. There are a couple of things about that part of the world. One is that the prevailing winds shift from summer to winter. In July, the prevailing winds go from east to west along this area. And then in January, the prevailing winds go in the opposite direction, so that people could realize that they could go out to sea with the winds at their back, because the primitive craft that they used did not sail very well into the wind. They had to be very careful about doing that. And they know they could go out, and then when the season changed, the wind shifted, they could make their way back. Another thing about the nursery, the voyaging nursery that we talked about, this is a map showing the tracks of cyclones, as hurricanes are known in Asia, over many, many years. And you'll notice that they are either concentrated north of this area or south of this area. So this was a place where it was relatively safe to travel these long distances. You were not likely to encounter hurricane winds when you're doing that. So that was another factor that made this voyaging nursery a possibility. In fact, you probably see over here, this is taken from a book that talks about this theory, and they use the term voyaging nursery. Now, the canoes that were used were large and fast and actually quite safe, quite stable. In the beginning, they were probably the single-hulled craft with an outrigger over here for stability. Later on, they were probably double-hulled. The hulls tended to be dug-out logs, or in the larger canoes, planking attached to a log keel. In other words, they'd get a log from a tree, and then they'd cut planks and seal the bottom of the boat between the planks that are laid down. The sails were the ones that the Europeans later encountered, probably the same as the ones they had used earlier. They were mats made of palm leaves that were woven together. The sails were made from this quite strong material, and actually lasted in heavy winds. They would not be torn apart, and they would last for a relatively long time. Then later, larger craft, and here's a drawing of one of those, could carry enough supplies to travel for a month with a range of several thousand miles. You'd get families on these very large craft with enough food to carry them for quite a long distance. They navigated by observing the stars, the sun, clouds, currents, swells in the ocean, bird flight patterns if they got close enough to land. The sun and the stars could tell them where they were in terms of latitude, because you could measure how high above the horizon at noon the sun was, or the stars were at a certain time of night. They used dead reckoning to decide where they were in terms of longitude, because, of course, with their primitive devices, there was no way to accurately measure longitude. But as they experimented over the generations, they were able to come up with ways of telling how far out they were going as well. They probably sent out scouting expeditions at first. They didn't load up the families on these large canoes. They probably sent people out in smaller ones, probably just the men, basically, who went out and discovered the next island, and then came back and said, okay, we know where it is, let's put together an expedition. A question also arises, why did they do this? Well, probably because during much of this time, population growth on islands, because they were almost all on islands, meant that they would outgrow the food supply. And then there would be violence between various groups, and certain groups would have to get out. It was sort of an imperative to leave where they were. An interesting description of this. Have any of you seen this? It's a fairly new movie. It's a Disney movie called Moana. I saw it just before I left with one of my grandsons. And it goes into some detail in a kind of a fanciful version, obviously. It is a Disney cartoon film. But they talk about, they demonstrate actually a lot of the things that I've been talking about here on how a group of people needs to leave an island to move on, and how they go out. Of course, it also incorporates a lot of the Polynesian mythology this character is someone known as Maui, who is a demigod, very important in Polynesian folklore, even in Maori folklore as well. The young lady is Moana, who travels with him on one of these great expeditions. I strongly urge you to see it if you get a chance. I actually didn't check with the ship, but I think it's too new to actually be on the ship. But do look for it when you get home. So, the conclusion of all of this is that there was this purposeful, steady colonization from west to east, except for, of course, the voyages up to Hawaii and down to New Zealand, which kind of went in the reverse, one north and one southwest. And this is confirmed by all of the other evidence, linguistic, archaeological, genetic, botanical evidence. And one example of the cultural similarities, particularly over the Polynesian part of this, is this. This is the New Zealand haka. Well, the University of Hawaii American football team also does something similar to the haka. My guess is that the Hawaiians adopted this after watching the All Blacks, the New Zealand team, do the haka. But in fact, there is a Hawaiian traditional warrior dance called the ha'akoa. And ha'a and haka are very close together. So in fact, this is a reflection, I think, even though it's sort of very modern, a reflection of the fact that there are these cultural similarities throughout Polynesia. There are other things like tattoos being an important part of culture, or cooking food by burying it in the ground. Several of our stops, we've heard about that, and we'll see it, and I showed it again on the talk about the Maori. So there are a number of things that are very similar in these cultures throughout the Pacific. Now, there's one problem with the theory that I've talked about. That is, there is a plant called the sweet potato, not a yam. It's a sweet potato, which is different. I didn't know that until I started looking into this question. And the sweet potato, actually, the origins of the sweet potato lie in the Americas. They were not known to Europeans until Columbus, and then somewhat later when Europeans began to travel in the Pacific. But the botanists tell us that the origin of the sweet potato is in the Americas. Sweet potato you find everywhere on the islands, particularly in New Zealand. This is a picture of the Maori cultivating the sweet potato. It actually tended to thrive better in New Zealand than on most of the other Polynesian islands because the climate was more temperate, much more similar to where the sweet potato originated from in the Americas. So this was, in fact, one of the things that Heyerdahl said confirmed his theory of Kon-Tiki. The problem is that the people in the Americas living along the west coast of Central America and South America did not have a seafaring tradition. There's no sign of any people who actually sailed far away from their homeland. And so what probably happened is that some of the Polynesians at some point actually sailed all the way to South America or Central America. They picked up some of the sweet potatoes and brought them back to the islands, and that is how the sweet potato became such an important part of the diet of the Polynesians. Many of the places that the Maleo-Polynesians went to, they were the first human beings. This map shows human migration before what I've just been talking about, the Austronesian explosion. Originally out of Africa, then up here, and this is where basically Caucasians originated and then spread out this way. The Asians started over here, spread out this way. But long before them, there were the people of the southern migration who came down into the islands, into Australia, New Guinea, and so forth. But these earlier migrations did not touch on the Pacific Islands, as you can see from here, did not touch on Madagascar, did not touch on New Zealand. So in many of the places that the Maleo-Polynesians went, they were the first people there. In other places where there had been people arriving earlier, particularly in the islands down here of Indonesia and the Philippines and Malaysia, and over here in New Guinea. Uh, the culture of the Malayo-Polynesians was much more advanced than of these people, because it was a much later stage in human development where the Malayo-Polynesians, when they started coming out, they had their navigation techniques, they had wet rice agriculture, they had domesticated animals, which the other people did not have, and particularly when we talk about Australia, we will see that. And so, in fact, they came into an area, and because they were culturally more advanced, they were able to dominate the local peoples, and they drove them into more isolated areas. When we lived in Malaysia, there's a group of people in Malaysia known as the Orang Asli, the original people, and in peninsular Malaysia, they live up in the mountains. They don't speak the Malay language. They don't speak a Malayo-Polynesian language. They are the descendants of these earlier people who were basically driven out of the more fertile areas by the more advanced Malayo-Polynesians. The same way in Indonesia, some of the more remote islands have some of these people in them, but the areas that were were better cultivated became dominated by the Malayo-Polynesian people. There's one final problem with all of this. What did the Austronesians miss? It's pretty obvious, isn't it? I mean, this map is really not fair because Madagascar isn't down here. Nonetheless, Australia, there is almost no evidence that the Malayo-Polynesians ever had a cultural impact on Australia. Australian or Aboriginal languages do not include any words that are related to the Malayo-Polynesian languages. There are no cultural practices that are similar to the Malayo-Polynesian practices. I want to talk just a little bit about Australia. The first settlers, the Aborigines, arrived about 40 to 50,000 years ago. They were part of that migration I showed on the other map, the southern migration that happened long before the Austronesian explosion. And before about 12,000 years ago, Australia and New Guinea were a single continent called Sahul, and the gray area is where the land was, because much of the world's water was taken up in the Ice Age and in the glaciers in the northern and southern hemispheres. And so the closest island that was not part of this continent was the island of Timor here. And there was a gap of about 60 miles at the largest extent of Sahul. And apparently these people came across this 60 miles, again, 40 to 50,000 years ago. Some people say possibly even longer. We don't know what kind of techniques they had, but it's generally thought that this was a single movement of these people, a magnificent human undertaking. You think about it, because land was not visible. This was long before the Malayo-Polynesians had their sailing techniques. In any case, these people came into this larger continent. Eventually, the ice melted, the sea rose, and Australia was cut off from the rest of the world for tens of thousands of years. And there was no evidence of anybody having any contact with Australia, which is one of the reasons why the cultural practices in Australia are so different from anywhere in the world. And of course, Australia, like New Zealand, has its own very unique flora and fauna, which we'll see when we get there and when I begin to talk about Australia for those who are staying on. So if the Austronesians were such great sailors and they traveled over these great distances, why is there no evidence that they ever colonized the great landmass of Australia? They came quite close. We know they did go into New Guinea up here. They went to New Zealand over here. But again, no sign that they really had much of a cultural impact on Australia. But in fact, there probably was some contact. And this is one bit of evidence that they probably did in their canoes land on the Australian continent. And that is the Australian dingo. This is a wild dog, sometimes domesticated by the Aborigines. Apparently only arrived about 3,500 years ago. And the origins of this particular kind of dog lie in Asia. And so probably these Malayo-Polynesians who happened to land in Australia brought the dingo with them, or the ancestors of the dingo with them. But that is really the only evidence that there was any outside contact by the people that we've been talking about. The only outside human contact with Australia evident today actually didn't come until the 1600s, when Dutch sailors traveling to the Indies landed at various places along the coast. There was one other example of some Malayo-Polynesian contact, but very, very late. In the 17th or the 18th centuries, fishermen from a place called Makassar on the island of Celebes or Sulawesi in today's Indonesia began to come to northern Australia to harvest sea slugs, or trepang as they're called, and then bring them back, and they actually sold them to China, where they were a great delicacy. But no outsiders settled permanently in Australia until the British arrived in Sydney in 1788. So it's hard to say definitively why the Austronesians didn't settle in Australia. Most likely reasons, the same thing that kept Europeans from settling in Australia for 200 years after Australians first discovered the Australian continent, particularly these Dutch sailors. The environment is harsh. It's very different from the islands of Southeast Asia or the Pacific. Wet rice agriculture would not thrive too well in the Australian environment. So it probably was, and the people that they met, if they did indeed have some contact, which they probably did, they considered to be quite primitive compared to them, and it just was not a particularly inviting climate for them to come. There are probably also factors like wind patterns and the current patterns that made it more difficult for them to come to Australia. I actually got in touch with an Australian academic when I was preparing this years ago, and asked him this question: why did the Malayo-Polynesians not have an impact on Australia? And he gave me some of these thoughts that I've just given to you, but his final conclusion was, you just can't prove why something didn't happen. You can question why things did happen, and you can find reasons for that, but trying to describe why something didn't happen is almost impossible. So we're left with this big question, in fact, why did the Austronesians miss Australia? But what is important, though, is what the Austronesians or the Malayo-Polynesians did do. They settled a vast portion of the Earth's surface. Here's a map showing, it's a world map that shows how far they went. In fact, this map also shows this question mark, showing that this is what I was talking about with the sweet potato. That's probably how the sweet potato got back here, that some of them sailed to the Americas, somewhere in the Americas, and brought the sweet potato back. So what they did accomplish, even though they didn't settle Australia, what they did accomplish was, in this relatively short period of time in human history, they sailed over a vast portion of the Earth's surface using navigational techniques that long predated those skills in Europe. The European age of exploration didn't begin until the late 1400s, Christopher Columbus and so forth, but by then the Austronesian explosion had ended. This movement of these peoples had ended with the arrival of the Maori in New Zealand. So that's the story. I'm fascinated by it. I hope you found it interesting as well. But it does tell you a little bit about many of the places that we're going on this trip. I want to thank you all, those of you who are getting off the ship. Thanks very much for attending the lectures. I want to thank the people in the booth up there for all of their help. I want to thank Jamie and Dana. They're always very supportive for the lecturers who come on the ship. And most of all, I really want to thank all of you for spending the time with me if you're getting off. And if you're not, let's all enjoy New Zealand, because we don't have any sea days for a while. I'll be back, I think. Actually, we haven't worked out the schedule yet, or if they have, they haven't told me. But I'll probably be talking on the way over to Australia, and then for sure I've got about 7 lectures on Australia. Then I'll be talking about Southeast Asia for the rest of the time until we get off in Burma. Anyway, thank you very much.
What I meant to ask you before the talk was, the performance we had from the Fijians.
Uh-huh.
They all had afros, and while supposedly the indentured servants